Routine traffic stop escalates, a moment of reckoning. As the evening sun began to fade over the city of Denver, casting long shadows across the streets, Malik Jackson was driving home from a day of work. His sedan hummed along the road, the low hum of the engine and the soft murmur of a podcast filling the quiet space of the car. It had been a long day, and Malik couldn't wait to get home, sit down, and unwind. The city was bustling around him, the familiar sights of downtown slowly slipping past the windows as he eased into a rhythm of his drive. But as he approached an intersection, the light flickered from yellow to red, and without thinking, Malik slowed his car down to a stop. He wasn't in a hurry, just a man going home after a full day. That's when it happened. The harsh, flashing blue and red lights filled his rearview mirror, followed by the piercing sound of a siren. A deep sigh escaped Malik's chest, but his hands gripped the wheel a little tighter. He pulled over and rolled down the window. Out stepped Officer Daniel West, his uniform crisp, his badge glinting under the fading light. Malik could sense the officer's confident stride as he approached, the kind of walk that spoke of someone who was used to being in control. Officer West didn't greet him or offer any pleasantries. Instead, he simply asked for Malik's license and registration in a tone that was more order than question. Malik complied, keeping his movements calm and deliberate. His heart wasn't racing, but there was an edge to the interaction now. Something didn't feel right, even as the officer's cold eyes swept over him, lingering a little too long. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Officer West's voice was flat, but there was a trace of something else, something more personal, behind the words. "I'm not sure," Malik responded, trying to keep his voice even. "I thought I came to a full stop at the light." "You didn't," West replied quickly, then paused. His eyes narrowed as if looking for a reason to escalate things, his posture subtly shifting. "Where are you headed?" "Home," Malik answered, his voice calm, though a sense of unease settled in his chest. He could feel the tension building, a shift in the air that made it clear this wasn't just a routine stop. The officer's eyes never left him, scanning him with a strange intensity. West took a step back and looked at the papers in his hand, but instead of returning them, he lingered. "Step out of the car," he demanded suddenly. Malik's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his fingers pressing into the leather. His mind raced, but his face remained composed. "Is there a reason for that, officer?" A flicker of frustration crossed Officer West's face before he replied, "Do you want to make this harder than it needs to be?" The threat was clear in his voice, unspoken but heavy. Malik exhaled slowly, the weight of the situation settling deeper into his chest. He opened the car door and stepped out. West's eyes swept over him, his tall frame, his sharp suit, his professional appearance, but it didn't matter. None of it mattered in that moment. Malik's demeanor, his calmness in the face of suspicion, was unsettling to Officer West. "Hands where I can see them," West ordered, his voice now edged with more command. Malik placed his hands in the air, his posture unthreatening but firm. "What are you looking for?" Malik asked, his voice steady despite the rising tension. "Just a routine check," West muttered, but there was a bitterness in his tone. He was acting as though he had already decided Malik was guilty of something, though he had no reason to believe it. Malik's eyes narrowed slightly, but his voice remained even. "Incidents involving men in business suits driving sedans, or does this have something to do with something else?" West froze for a moment, his composure faltering. The question landed like a punch, but instead of backing down, Officer West pushed forward. The power struggle between them wasn't about a traffic violation anymore, it was something deeper. Malik could see that the officer wasn't used to being challenged. He wasn't used to someone like Malik not flinching, not being intimidated. He could feel the power shift in the air, as though West's control was slipping away with each word, with each moment that passed. Malik stood his ground, his confidence not born of arrogance but of clarity. He wasn't going to back down. He wasn't going to allow this officer's bias to dictate the terms of this encounter. "Officer," Malik began slowly, "I think it's time you understand who I am." West's brow furrowed. "I don't care who you are," he snapped, but there was something weaker in his tone now. Malik didn't flinch. He reached into his jacket pocket, slowly, deliberately, making sure the officer saw every movement. "I think you'll want to know," Malik said quietly, "I'm the head of internal affairs for the Denver Police Department." Officer West froze, the color draining from his face as he looked down at Malik's badge. His arrogance evaporated in an instant, replaced by a rush of uncertainty. He had made an assumption, and now that assumption was about to cost him. Malik didn't raise his voice, didn't make a scene. But his words carried the weight of the moment, and the officer knew it. This wasn't just about the violation anymore. This was about accountability, respect, and the truth. "The badge doesn't make you better than anyone," Malik said, his voice calm but cutting. "It makes you accountable to everyone." With that, Malik stepped back toward his car, his future with the department already set in motion. This interaction wasn't just about one officer's mistake, it was about the need for change, and it had only just begun. As the engine hummed back to life, Malik glanced in the rearview mirror, watching Officer West stand there, his world turned upside down. The journey home was quiet, but in Malik's mind, it was anything but. The real work was just beginning. Officers' assumptions and tensions, a test of character. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the streets of Chicago, and Jamal Thompson was driving home after another busy day at his tech startup. The smooth hum of his car and the soft jazz playing on the radio created a calming backdrop to the bustling city. He was looking forward to a quiet evening, a warm meal, and some time to himself. But as he slowed down at an intersection, a flash of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror disrupted the serenity. The loud blast of a siren followed, cutting through the peaceful atmosphere. Jamal pulled over without hesitation, his brow furrowing slightly as he adjusted the mirror. He could feel the tension in the air, but he remained calm, knowing that it was just a routine stop. He rolled down his window as the police cruiser came to a halt behind him. Out stepped Officer Carla Simmons, a woman in her mid-30s with sharp eyes and a firm stride. Her uniform was neatly pressed, and her badge gleamed as she approached. "License and registration," she said, her voice firm but not unfriendly. Jamal nodded, reaching for his documents in the glove compartment. He handed them over, his movements controlled and deliberate. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Officer Simmons asked, her tone already carrying an edge, as though she had already made up her mind about something. Jamal, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, replied calmly, "I'm not sure, officer. I thought I made the stop in time." Simmons murmured, looking at him for a moment before glancing down at his license. "You didn't come to a complete stop," she said, the words sharper than before. Jamal's brow furrowed slightly, but he didn't challenge her. He knew how quickly things could escalate if he did. "I see," he replied, his tone still polite but measured. "I thought I did, but I understand." Officer Simmons didn't respond immediately, and instead, she stared at Jamal a little longer, her gaze probing, as though searching for something. She could sense his calmness, but it made her uneasy. Something about him wasn't fitting into the box she had already mentally placed him in. "Where are you headed?" she asked, her voice carrying a subtle edge, a tone that suggested suspicion. Jamal wasn't about to show any signs of discomfort. "Home," he said, his voice steady, betraying no hint of concern. Her eyes narrowed as she took in his appearance, a well-dressed man in his early 30s, with a confident air about him. The tailored suit, the polished shoes, nothing about him screamed danger. But that made her suspicious. She wasn't used to seeing people who didn't fit the profile. Jamal's demeanor, his calm response, was unsettling in a way she couldn't quite explain. "Step out of the car," Simmons ordered, her voice now more commanding. Jamal felt a flicker of hesitation deep within him, but he didn't let it show. He took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, his hands steady as he placed them on the hood, just as she instructed. "Anything specific you're looking for, officer?" Jamal asked, his tone still even, still unflinching. "No," Simmons replied, her voice terse. "Routine. We've had some incidents around here recently." Jamal's mind raced for a moment, but he didn't let his face betray any sign of alarm. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, letting the silence stretch before speaking again. "Incidents with men in business suits driving sedans, or is this something else?" Her eyes flickered, a brief moment of vulnerability breaking through her otherwise confident exterior. It was as if she wasn't expecting him to push back, not with such directness, not with such calmness. She had expected him to cower, to get flustered, maybe even to show fear. But Jamal didn't. He remained firm, unwavering in his composure. And that, for some reason, put her on edge. Simmons took a step back, her hand subtly drifting toward her belt. Her fingers danced along the edge of her holster as she weighed her next move. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially not in such a poised and deliberate manner. Something about Jamal's steady gaze, his quiet confidence, made her question everything she had assumed. "You seem pretty confident," Simmons muttered, almost to herself. "Like you know how this works." Jamal met her gaze evenly. "Confidence isn't the issue here, officer," he said, his voice carrying a calm authority. "Respect is." Her posture shifted again, her uncertainty now palpable. He had seen it. She had crossed a line, one that she hadn't even realized was there until now. He wasn't just some random driver she could push around. He was someone who knew the system, who understood the power dynamics at play. Simmons stepped back, her eyes briefly darting to her cruiser. The moment of tension hung in the air, thick and heavy, as she considered her next move. But the doubt, the hesitation, was now clear. Jamal wasn't the type of person who would bow to her authority just because of a badge, and that truth, that realization, was unsettling. "Are we done here, officer?" Jamal asked after a beat, his voice steady but sharp. The words hung in the air, a challenge without a challenge, an assertion without aggression. It was clear he wasn't afraid, clear that this wasn't going to end in the way Officer Simmons had expected. She swallowed hard, reaching into her chest pocket and pulling out his license and registration. Her hands trembled slightly as she handed them back to him. Jamal took them without a word, slipping them back into his jacket pocket. He slid back into his car, starting the engine. Before pulling away, he glanced back at Simmons, his eyes locking with hers. "Remember this, officer," Jamal said softly, his voice quiet but firm. "It's not about the badge. It's about the respect you show the people you serve." As he drove away, the city fading into the distance, Jamal's mind was already thinking ahead. This interaction wasn't just about one officer's assumptions, it was about the broader system, about the need for change, and the weight of every decision. Realization of Jordan's identity, a moment of truth. The sky had already begun to turn a deep shade of orange, casting a warm glow over the streets of New York City as Jordan Williams drove home after a long day at his law firm. The hum of the city outside was drowned out by the soft jazz playing on the car stereo, an unlikely companion to the fast pace of the city that never seemed to sleep. Jordan was looking forward to a quiet evening, some time to himself, but the unexpected happened as he approached an intersection. The sudden flash of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror caught him off guard, followed by the shrill sound of a siren. His grip tightened on the steering wheel as he glanced at the rearview mirror. With a sigh, he pulled over, easing the car to the side of the road. He wasn't sure why he had been stopped, but he knew how these things often went. He rolled down his window, his posture still calm despite the rising tension. Officer Tim Harris, a man in his early 40s with a squared jaw and an air of authority, approached the car. His uniform was sharp, his badge gleaming in the dimming light of the evening. "License and registration," Harris commanded, his tone flat but firm. Jordan nodded, reaching for his documents. He handed them over without hesitation, his movements steady. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Officer Harris asked, his eyes narrowing slightly as he scanned Jordan's face. Jordan hesitated for only a second before responding, his voice steady. "I'm not entirely sure, officer. I believe I came to a complete stop at the light." "You didn't," Harris said bluntly, his voice devoid of any warmth. Jordan nodded politely but remained quiet, sensing that this wasn't just about a simple traffic stop anymore. Harris lingered by the window, studying him more intently than necessary. Jordan could feel the shift, the subtle change in the officer's demeanor. The man had made an assumption, one that was beginning to cloud his judgment. It wasn't about the traffic violation anymore. He was searching for something else, something Jordan hadn't given him a reason to suspect. He could sense Harris's discomfort with his calmness, his nonchalance. "Where are you headed?" Officer Harris asked, his voice now carrying an edge. Jordan glanced over at the officer, his expression neutral. "Home," he replied. His tone was unwavering, but he could tell the officer wasn't satisfied. Harris had already decided something about him, even without any evidence. Without warning, Harris stepped back and glanced at Jordan's license again. The officer folded the paper slowly, almost theatrically, as if giving himself more time to think. "Step out of the car," Harris ordered suddenly, the words ringing in the air like an ultimatum. Jordan's heart skipped a beat, but his face remained composed. "Is there a specific reason for that, officer?" he asked, his voice calm, even measured. "I said step out," Harris repeated, his tone firm, his hand moving closer to his holster. Jordan exhaled slowly, opening the door and stepping out, his hands raised slightly, palms facing the officer. The tension between them was palpable now, and it was clear that the officer was looking for something, anything, to justify his increasing suspicion. "What are you looking for, officer?" Jordan asked, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of challenge. Harris didn't answer immediately. Instead, he paced around Jordan, his eyes scanning the area. He was trying to regain control, trying to impose his authority. But Jordan wasn't going to let him. He wasn't going to play along with whatever narrative the officer had already constructed in his mind. The officer's eyes shifted, scanning Jordan's tailored suit, his polished shoes. He could feel the frustration growing, and that frustration only made him more determined to find something to back up his assumptions. "You know," Harris muttered, stepping closer, "you seem pretty calm for someone who's been pulled over. Almost like you know exactly what's going to happen next." Jordan met his gaze without flinching. "Confidence isn't the issue here, officer. Respect is," he said, his voice unwavering. The words cut through the air, and for the first time, Harris faltered. He had been expecting a reaction, fear, perhaps, or hesitation, but what he got instead was a quiet strength, a calm defiance that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Harris's jaw tightened, and he took a step back, trying to regain control of the situation. But Jordan wasn't done. He hadn't revealed his hand yet, and Harris had no idea what was coming. "Do you know who I am?" Jordan asked, his voice sharp. The question hung in the air for a moment, and Harris looked at him, his brow furrowing. "What's that supposed to mean?" he asked, though the doubt in his voice was evident. Jordan reached into his coat pocket slowly, making sure Harris saw every deliberate movement. The officer's eyes followed his hand, his own fingers twitching near his holster. Jordan pulled out a small leather wallet and opened it slowly, revealing his badge. "Jordan Williams," he said calmly, his voice carrying the weight of his words. "Head of Internal Affairs for the NYPD." For a brief moment, Harris froze. His eyes darted from the badge to Jordan's face, searching for any sign of a joke, any indication that this was some kind of prank. But there was nothing. Only quiet authority. Internal affairs. The realization hit Harris like a wave, the color draining from his face. He stepped back, his hand falling away from his holster as though the weight of his own actions had suddenly become too heavy to bear. Jordan didn't say another word, his expression remained calm, but there was a hint of disappointment in his eyes. Harris had crossed a line, and now, it was time to pay the price. This interaction? Jordan said quietly, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. It's not just about a traffic violation anymore. It's about respect. And accountability. Something you've clearly forgotten. With that, Jordan turned and got back into his car. As the engine roared to life, he glanced back at Officer Harris, still standing in the same spot, his world now unraveling. Jordan drove away, the city lights flickering in the distance, knowing that this moment would reverberate far beyond that street. Harris had no idea yet, but his life, his career, was about to change forever. And for Jordan, this was just the beginning. The officer's discomfort, confronting the system. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving a cold, dusky glow over the streets of Atlanta as Thomas Green navigated his way home after a long day at the community outreach program he ran. The evening was calm, a far cry from the noise of the city that had buzzed around him all day. He was eager to get home, relax, and spend time with his family. As he coasted through a quiet neighborhood, a sudden flash of red and blue lights cut through the calm, and the sound of a siren filled the air. A sigh escaped his lips as he slowed the car and pulled over to the side of the road. It wasn't the first time he'd been stopped, but something about this one felt different. He rolled down the window, watching as Officer Rachel Davis, mid-30s, sharp-eyed, and standing tall in her uniform, approached his car. There was a quiet authority in her steps, the kind that often came from years of experience on the force. "License and registration," she said, her voice firm, with a touch of impatience. Thomas, a tall and well-groomed man in his early 40s, didn't hesitate. His hands moved deliberately, calmly reaching for the documents in the glove compartment. He handed them over with a slight nod, offering no resistance, just a quiet acceptance of the situation. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Officer Davis asked, her tone flat, but tinged with an edge. "I'm not entirely sure, officer," Thomas replied evenly, his voice steady. "I thought I came to a complete stop at the light." Davis stared at him for a moment, her eyes narrowing as she inspected his license. She didn't respond immediately. The pause between them stretched on, and in that silence, Thomas could feel the subtle shift in her demeanor. She wasn't just concerned about the stop anymore. Something was nagging at her, something deeper. "You didn't stop at the line," Officer Davis finally said, though there was hesitation in her voice. It wasn't just about the stop. Thomas knew that much. Thomas tilted his head slightly, trying to read the situation. "I see," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But I believe I stopped well enough. However, I understand." Davis lingered by his window, her gaze not leaving him. Thomas could feel her studying him more than she needed to, as if she was looking for something else. She shifted slightly, her posture tense, and for a brief moment, Thomas saw the glint of suspicion in her eyes. She wasn't just questioning him about the traffic violation, she was searching for a reason to escalate the situation. "Where are you headed?" she asked, her voice taking on a sharper tone than before. "Home," Thomas answered, his voice unwavering. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about a simple mistake. It was about something bigger. Davis didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked him up and down, her eyes scanning his professional appearance, the tailored suit, the polished shoes. Everything about Thomas screamed success, confidence, and stability. Yet, that only seemed to fuel her suspicions. In her mind, he didn't fit the profile of someone who should be behind the wheel in this part of town. "Step out of the car," Officer Davis ordered suddenly, the command sharp, catching Thomas off guard. For a brief second, Thomas's heart skipped. But his face remained calm. He had dealt with situations like this before, though it had never been this personal. "Is there a reason for that, officer?" he asked, his voice quiet but assertive. "I said step out," she repeated, her eyes hardening. The tension was rising, and Thomas could feel it. He had been here before, he knew when someone was looking for a reason to assert their power. With a steady exhale, Thomas opened the door and stepped out of the car, his movements deliberate, controlled. His posture remained unshaken, his hands visible, placed slightly in front of him. "What are you looking for, officer?" he asked again, his voice unwavering. "Routine check," she muttered, but there was an undercurrent of something else in her tone. "We've had some issues around here recently." Thomas tilted his head, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Incidents involving people in business suits driving sedans? Or does this go beyond that?" The words hung in the air for a beat, and for the first time, Officer Davis faltered. It was a subtle shift, a crack in the mask of authority she had worn so confidently just moments before. Her posture stiffened, and she took a small step back, trying to regain the control she had lost. But the silence between them was no longer just a pause, it was the weight of her discomfort, the realization that she had been trying to assert dominance without just cause. "Look," Thomas began, his voice steady but pointed. "This situation, it's not just about this stop. It's about something bigger. It's about why you felt the need to escalate this when I hadn't given you any reason to." His gaze never wavered from hers. "What does this say about your assumptions, about how you view people like me?" Officer Davis stiffened at his words, her mouth opening slightly, as though she wanted to respond, but the words didn't come. She was caught. Her discomfort was palpable now, as if the weight of his challenge had landed squarely on her shoulders. This wasn't just a man she was stopping, it was a mirror reflecting the biases she hadn't fully acknowledged. Thomas didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His calmness, his steady gaze, was far more powerful than any confrontation could have been. "This isn't just about a traffic stop, officer," he said softly, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "It's about a pattern. It's about assumptions and the discomfort that comes when those assumptions are questioned. You need to ask yourself why this felt necessary. Why you needed to prove something to me, even though I hadn't given you a reason." Officer Davis's shoulders sagged slightly, her eyes dropping to the ground as if the weight of her own actions was finally sinking in. The silence between them was thick with understanding, a moment of reckoning that neither of them would forget. Without another word, Thomas returned to his car, his mind already racing through the implications of what had just occurred. The encounter wasn't just about one officer's discomfort. It was about a system that allowed those biases to flourish unchecked. And it was clear that this wasn't over. As the engine roared to life, Thomas drove away, the sound of the city surrounding him once again. But for Officer Davis, the silence would linger. The discomfort would stay with her long after the stop ended. And the realization, one she wasn't ready to face, would challenge her far more than any simple traffic violation ever could. Jordan's action and next steps, a call for change. The morning sun streamed through the blinds of Jordan Williams's office as he sat at his desk, the events from the previous night still fresh in his mind. The traffic stop had been more than just an uncomfortable encounter, it had been a wake-up call, both personal and professional. Jordan wasn't the type to let things go, he believed that if something needed to be addressed, it had to be done with purpose. This was no exception. With a sigh, he leaned back in his chair, picking up the file in front of him. It was Officer Rachel Davis's record, the very same officer who had stopped him the night before. Jordan had known from the moment he revealed his identity that Davis would feel the weight of her actions. But what troubled him more than the officer's immediate discomfort was the realization that this wasn't an isolated incident, it was a reflection of a larger, systemic issue within the department. And Jordan had seen it before. As he flipped through the file, he found several minor complaints about Davis, unnecessary stops, allegations of profiling, and an overall lack of de-escalation during interactions. But there was something else, something deeper, that Jordan couldn't ignore. These were not just small mistakes. These were signs of a larger problem that went beyond one officer. This was about how certain assumptions, biases, and unchecked behaviors had crept into the very fabric of the department. It was about how the system allowed these actions to go unchallenged for far too long. Jordan knew what needed to be done. He couldn't just sweep this under the rug, nor could he let it slide as a minor infraction. This was the moment to address the culture within the department, the culture that had allowed people like Officer Davis to act without consequence. Jordan wasn't going to allow this to be just another bad interaction. He had the power, the authority, and most importantly, the responsibility to do something about it. He picked up his phone and made a call to his assistant, Linda. "Linda, I need you to set up a meeting with Chief Daniels for this afternoon. And I want a full departmental review on my desk by the end of the week. It's time we address the culture within this department, once and for all." Linda's voice crackled through the phone with a note of surprise, but she quickly agreed. "Understood, Mr. Williams. I'll have it arranged." Jordan hung up the phone and stood from his desk. He paced the room for a moment, collecting his thoughts. The next steps were crucial. He wasn't just going to push for an internal review of Officer Davis's actions. He was going to call for a sweeping reform of the department's protocols, training, and accountability measures. There was too much at stake. He needed to ensure that this wouldn't be swept under the rug, that this moment of reckoning wouldn't be forgotten. This had to lead to lasting change. As Jordan prepared for his meeting with Chief Daniels, he couldn't shake the thought that this wasn't just about one officer. It was about an institution that had failed to recognize its own flaws, its own biases, and its own deep-seated issues. Jordan had seen firsthand how easy it was for the system to justify actions like Davis's. But it was time for that to change. When he walked into Chief Daniels's office that afternoon, the weight of his decision was clear. Daniels, a seasoned veteran of the force, looked up from his desk as Jordan took a seat across from him. There was a flicker of understanding in Daniels's eyes, as if he knew what was coming. "Chief," Jordan began, his voice steady, "I've reviewed Officer Davis's record. It's not just about what happened last night, it's about everything that led up to it. There are patterns here, issues that have been ignored for far too long. We can't afford to continue sweeping these things under the rug. The department needs to change, and we need to start with a full review." Daniels rubbed his temples, his face creased with the stress of the job. "I know Davis isn't the first officer with these kinds of complaints. But Jordan, you're asking for a lot. This isn't just about one officer, it's about the department as a whole. We've always handled these things internally, quietly." Jordan leaned forward, his voice firm but not angry. "Quiet doesn't fix anything, Chief. It allows the problem to fester. I've seen it before. We need a complete overhaul. Training, protocols, accountability, everything. And it has to be public. It's time we hold ourselves to a higher standard." For a moment, Chief Daniels didn't respond. He just looked at Jordan, weighing his words. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "You're going to ruffle some feathers with this. You know that, right?" Jordan nodded. "I do. But it's about time someone did. The department needs to understand that accountability isn't optional, it's a requirement." The meeting continued for another hour, with Jordan outlining his plans for the review, his vision for reform, and the steps that needed to be taken. By the time he left Chief Daniels's office, Jordan felt a sense of resolve settle over him. This was just the beginning. The following weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, interviews, and consultations. Jordan worked tirelessly, meeting with officers, community leaders, and legal experts. He gathered data, analyzed patterns, and held public forums to hear directly from the people most affected by the department's actions. The incident with Officer Davis had sparked something much bigger than a routine review. It had become a catalyst for systemic change. In the end, Jordan's efforts led to a broad, department-wide reform, new training programs focused on de-escalation, stronger accountability measures, and a public commitment to addressing bias within the force. Officer Davis, for her part, faced an internal hearing, and though the department didn't strip her of her badge, the hearing marked a turning point. It was a sign that things were changing, that actions like hers wouldn't be tolerated anymore. As Jordan sat at his desk late one evening, reviewing the final report, he knew the journey was far from over. But he also knew that this was the first step toward a better, more accountable department. And that was enough for now. Catalyst for change, transforming the system from within. The weeks following the incident with Officer Rachel Davis were a whirlwind for Jordan Williams. What had started as an uncomfortable traffic stop had quickly transformed into something far more significant, a catalyst for change that would challenge not just the behavior of one officer, but the culture of the entire police department. Jordan knew that if he wanted to see real progress, he couldn't just let this moment slip away. He had to push for accountability, not just for Officer Davis, but for the entire system that allowed such actions to persist. As the head of the Internal Affairs Division, Jordan had the authority to instigate reforms, and he was determined to do so. He understood that addressing one isolated incident would not create lasting change. This was about confronting the broader issues at play, the systemic biases, the lack of training on de-escalation, and the culture that had normalized unnecessary aggression and profiling. For too long, these problems had been brushed aside or handled quietly, out of sight and out of mind. Jordan wasn't going to let that happen anymore. His first step was to call for a department-wide review, something bigger than anything the department had seen in years. This was about more than just investigating misconduct, it was about holding the entire department to a higher standard. Jordan knew that real change would require more than a few meetings and reports, it would require a cultural shift. Officers had to understand that their actions didn't just affect the people they interacted with, they impacted the very trust that the community had in law enforcement. Jordan sat down with Chief Daniels, laying out his vision for reform. This isn't just about holding officers accountable for their actions, he said, his voice steady but filled with conviction. It's about rethinking how we train, how we engage with the community, and how we hold ourselves accountable, not just to the law, but to the people we serve. Chief Daniels nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "You know this won't be easy, right?" he said, his voice tinged with skepticism. "The department's not going to change overnight. You're going to ruffle feathers, Jordan." Jordan met his gaze without flinching. "I know. But that's the point. We can't keep sweeping this under the rug. It's time we get uncomfortable. It's time we have the hard conversations." The process was slow at first. Jordan gathered data, compiled reports, and met with community leaders. He spoke to officers, holding forums where they could discuss their challenges and the biases they faced on a daily basis. He listened, really listened, to what people had to say. It became clear that the issues ran much deeper than just a few bad apples. This was about a broken system, one that didn't always value transparency or trust. But as the weeks passed, the momentum began to build. More and more officers began to speak out, acknowledging the need for change. Some were reluctant at first, but Jordan's approach was different. He didn't come at them with judgment or blame. Instead, he created a space for open dialogue, for understanding. Slowly but surely, the department began to shift. The tipping point came during a meeting with city officials, when Jordan presented his findings and his proposal for reform. He called for new training programs focused on cultural sensitivity, de-escalation, and community engagement. He pushed for better accountability measures, clearer consequences for officers who violated policies, and stronger support for those who were working hard to make a difference. This isn't just about changing policies, Jordan said, his voice steady but firm. This is about changing mindsets. This is about ensuring that every officer knows they're not just representing the law, they're representing the community. The room fell silent as Jordan's words hung in the air. It was clear that his vision was starting to resonate. This wasn't just about one bad officer. This was about a movement, a moment in time when the department could choose to evolve, to grow, and to build the trust that had been broken for so long. As the meeting ended, Jordan knew there was still a long road ahead. Reforms wouldn't happen overnight. But this was a start that was driven by the painful realization of the flaws within the system and the determination to change them. Jordan wasn't just pushing for a better department, he was fighting for a better future for everyone. And as Jordan left the meeting, he couldn't help but think of the many people who had been affected by these issues, people like him, people who wanted to see real change but had been let down by the system time and time again. He knew that this was just the beginning. Now, the question was, would the department rise to the occasion? Would they choose accountability, integrity, and real reform? Jordan's work wasn't over, but the foundation had been laid. What do you think? Are you ready for change in law enforcement? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to stay updated on this ongoing journey of reform and accountability. Together, we can create a better future.